The body had hung there for hours, gently swaying in the October breeze, just off the main road leading into town. Cars had slowed as they passed, drivers glancing at the silhouette in the dim light, some with a chuckle or an appreciative nod at what they assumed was a Halloween decoration. Another one of those macabre displays that pop up this time of year. The figure hung from a tree, limp, arms dangling at unnatural angles. Even up close, the details seemed too perfect. The slack jaw, the vacant eyes staring out from under stringy hair, and a dark stain that had spread across her sweater. But no one thought to take a second look. After all, people in our town love to go overboard with their decorations, trying to outdo each other with ever more realistic scenes. I remember the first time I drove by it, the unease prickling the back of my neck. It was early morning, the sky still caught between night and dawn. The figure swayed as if greeting me, the shadows playing across its face in a way that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that whoever had set it up knew exactly how to play with the shadows. I didn't stop. I kept driving. By noon, the rumor mill had already begun to spin. Word spread about the realistic dummy hanging from that old oak tree. Someone even joked about how much time it must have taken to get the details right. The town's kids took selfies with it, grinning and throwing peace signs. But the smile of the figure never changed, its mouth caught in a grimace that seemed too desperate, too strained. It wasn't until dusk that someone finally noticed. A woman, someone's aunt, I think, decided to get a closer look, muttering about how people these days had no sense of decency. When she touched the arm, expecting it to be rubbery and cold, she found it warm, still pliable. Her scream tore through the evening quiet, sending crows scattering into the sky. The police arrived quickly after that, blocking off the road and shooing away the crowd that had gathered. I stood among them, watching as they struggled to cut the figure down, their hands shaking even in the falling temperature. When the body finally hit the ground with a thud, it became painfully clear. The bruises on her neck, the split skin under her nails, the way her limbs moved with a dead weight. She had been alive when they tied that rope around her neck, alive when they hoisted her up. I found myself caught in the suffocating hush of the crowd, my breath shallow, like I was the one who couldn't breathe. All those cars, all those people, all those hours that passed. How many of us had seen her and thought nothing of it? How many of us had laughed or driven by without a second thought? The weight of that thought settled over me, and the air seemed colder than before. I left before the officers began questioning, but the image of her face stayed with me. The desperation frozen in her eyes, the silent plea that no one had heard or chosen to hear. That night, when I tried to sleep, I kept imagining those eyes in the dark, wondering if she had watched me as I drove by, hoping for just one person to see her as she was. The guilt gnawed at me, growing sharper with every passing second, like something lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. In the end, they never found out how she got there or who did it. The whispers started soon after, talk of a prowler in the woods, of someone who knew how to make people disappear without a sound. But those are just stories, right? A way to make sense of something we all wish we hadn't seen. Yet every time I drive down that road, I can't help but glance at that old oak tree, half expecting to see a shadow hanging there again, a shape that no one will believe is real until it's far too late. And every time, I find myself hoping, deep down, that I'm wrong. The call came at 11:23 p.m. on Halloween night, just as I was about to drift off. The kids were asleep upstairs, still wearing their costumes, a little superhero and a witch. Their parents, out at a Halloween party, had asked me to watch them. A shiver ran through me as I picked up the phone. "Hi, is everything okay?" I asked, glancing at the baby monitor. The voice on the other end trembled. "Did you get a call just now? Someone called us, said there's someone in the house." My stomach dropped. The screen on the monitor showed the kids asleep, their blankets rising and falling with each breath. "It's probably a prank," I said, trying to sound steady. "We called the police, but can you check on them?" Their mom asked, her voice barely a whisper. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept upstairs. The plastic jack-o'-lantern lights cast an orange glow, flickering along the hallway. Each step creaked, the air thick with the weight of my own breath. When I reached the kids' room, they were still asleep, blankets pulled up to their chins. I let out a shaky sigh and turned back. But then I noticed a smear of red on the bathroom mirror down the hall. I swallowed hard, moving closer, and found words scrawled in red. "I'm watching you." Fear washed over me. I backed up, the bat shaking in my hands. My pulse pounded as I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the hallway was empty. I locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911 with trembling hands. But just as the call connected, I heard a floorboard creak outside. I pressed my ear to the door, listening as footsteps moved closer, then stopped right outside. A breath deliberate like someone waiting. The operator's voice was a lifeline, telling me to stay put until the police arrived. But the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I stayed frozen in the bathroom, staring at the words on the mirror, every second stretching into an eternity. The worst part? I wasn't sure if they had really left. The police arrived, but they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no intruder. The kids slept through it all, untouched by the fear that gripped me. But when they reviewed the security footage, they caught something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure slipped out the back door minutes before I went upstairs. A figure that seemed to know exactly where to hide, leaving only a haunting memory of Halloween fear behind. It started with the costume. My son, Max, begged me to take him to a local antique store's Halloween sale. He found an old-fashioned clown costume, dusty and worn. Something about it made my skin crawl, maybe the faded fabric, the painted-on smile of the mask. But Max loved it, so I bought it. He put it on immediately, running around the house. "Look, Dad, I'm a creepy clown," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. I smiled, but a cold knot of unease twisted in my stomach. That night, he insisted on wearing it to bed. By midnight, a soft thudding woke me. It sounded like someone knocking against the wall, steady, deliberate. I tiptoed to Max's room, the house darker than usual, the shadows stretching into strange shapes. Max was sitting up in bed, still wearing the mask, staring at the wall. "He doesn't like it when you take the mask off," he whispered, his voice distant. A shiver ran through me. "Who, Max? Who doesn't like it?" He pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a shape shifting in the dark, eyes glinting back at me. I tore off Max's mask, revealing his wide, glassy eyes. "He says it's Halloween," Max murmured, "and he likes it." I took the costume away, locking it in the attic. But that night, the knocking grew louder. When I checked on Max, the mask was back on his face, even though I had hidden it. He turned to me, the painted smile twisting in the dim light, whispering, "He doesn't like being hidden." I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, the darkness pressing in. The Halloween decorations outside cast strange shadows, and somewhere in the attic, I heard a faint, mocking knock, still there, still waiting. Halloween was a big deal in our building, with decorations lining every hallway. The old apartment complex, usually quiet, seemed to come alive, but that year felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the decorations somehow darker. I overheard a neighbor mentioning the new family that had moved into the apartment above ours. "They got a kid, right?" one asked. The other just nodded, looking uneasy. I shrugged it off, eager to collect candy that night. As I trick-or-treated, I couldn't stop glancing up at the window above our old apartment, the one that used to belong to a boy who'd moved away suddenly months before. I reached the new family's door and knocked, whispering trick or treat. The door creaked open, but no one stood there. I peered into the dim hallway and heard a soft scratching, like something dragging across the floor. My pulse quickened, but I turned back, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft click. That night, I asked my mom about the old family. She avoided my gaze. "The boy, he had nightmares," she said, voice tight. "He thought someone was in his room." As I lay in bed, the sound of scratching began again. It came from the ceiling, moving down the walls. I crept to the front door, listening with my ear pressed to the wood. A child's voice murmured on the other side, singing a slow, eerie song. I swung the door open, but the hallway was empty. except for a small figure in a cheap mask at the top of the stairs. "Trick or treat," he whispered, his voice muffled and distant. I stepped back, my mouth dry. He turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, the new family was gone. The police said there was no record of a child. But sometimes, when the wind picks up, I hear that song outside my window, just above a faint scratching on the walls. We decided to host a Halloween party at our new house, a way to meet the neighbors. The old Victorian seemed perfect for the occasion, with its creaky floors and stained glass windows. We decorated every room, from fake cobwebs to flickering jack-o'-lanterns on the porch. The house looked eerie yet festive, and by nightfall, it was filled with laughter and clinking glasses. But as the night wore on, Greg pulled me aside, looking uneasy. "Have you seen the guy in a mask?" he whispered, nodding toward the crowded room. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Everyone's in costume." Greg shook his head. "No, this guy's different. Old suit, creepy mask. It's like he doesn't belong here." I glanced around, but didn't see anything unusual. I shrugged it off, thinking he was imagining things. But later, I spotted him near the stairs, a man in a tattered suit, wearing a blank, white mask that hid his entire face. It was like a mannequin's head, with hollow, dark eyes. A shiver ran through me. I tried to approach, but by the time I reached the stairs, he was gone. The party dwindled around midnight, and we said goodbye to the last of the guests. As the door shut, I realized we never saw the masked man leave. The house grew still, shadows stretching across the walls as the candle flames flickered. Greg and I exchanged uneasy glances. "I think he's still inside," I whispered. We crept upstairs, following the sound of soft footsteps. The hallway felt colder, the air pressing down on us. Each door we checked led to an empty room, but the last one, leading to the attic, was ajar. A faint light spilled out, and my stomach twisted. Greg pushed the door open, and we climbed the stairs to the attic. Dusty furniture and old boxes cluttered the space, and there, in the far corner, stood the masked figure. "Hey, time to go home," Greg called, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Greg stepped closer, reaching out to touch the mask. Suddenly, the figure turned, its head tilting as if studying us. A cold voice, barely a whisper, slipped through the silence. "He never left, you know." The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When the light steadied, the figure was gone, leaving only the creak of the house around us. We hurried down the stairs, locking the door behind us, our nerves frayed. In the morning, Greg found something scratched into the attic doorframe. A name, faded and barely legible. It matched the records of a man who disappeared from the house on Halloween nearly a century ago. It was the last Halloween I'd spend in our old house on the edge of town. The trees surrounding the property were bare, and the wind howled through their branches like a lonely whisper. My parents were away for the night, trusting that at 16, I could handle myself. I wasn't thrilled about spending Halloween alone, but I figured I'd make the best of it. Watch some horror movies, eat the leftover candy, and keep the porch light on for any last-minute trick-or-treaters. By 10 o'clock, the neighborhood had grown quiet. Most of the kids were done, and the streets were empty, except for the occasional flickering of Halloween decorations. I settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn, letting the low hum of the TV fill the silence. But just as I started to relax, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, spilling popcorn everywhere. Who could it be this late? I grabbed the candy bowl, figuring it was one of the older kids playing a Halloween prank. When I opened the door, I found a boy standing on the porch. He looked about 10, wearing an old-fashioned costume, a dusty suit, and a simple black mask that covered his face. I forced a smile, holding out the bowl. "Trick or treat," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He didn't move or reach for the candy. He just stood there, staring at me through the eye holes of the mask. A chill ran through me. "Hey, are you lost?" I asked, glancing up and down the street, but there was no one else around. Finally, the boy spoke. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. "Can I come inside?" The words hung in the air, heavy with an unease I couldn't shake. "No, sorry, I I began, but before I could finish, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the driveway and into the shadows. I stood there, heart pounding, wondering why his presence had felt so wrong. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. The air inside the house felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer across the room. I returned to the couch, but my mind kept wandering back to the boy. Something about the way he'd spoken, the empty look in those dark eye holes. It lingered like a sour taste. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the back door. I froze, every muscle tensing. No one ever used the back door, especially not trick-or-treaters. The wind rattled the windows, and I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a branch scraping against the glass. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My breath caught. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, creeping through the darkened hallway toward the back door. When I shone the light through the window, I half expected to see the boy again. But there was no one there, just the porch light casting a dim circle in the night. I turned to head back to the living room, but then I heard it. Footsteps in the kitchen, slow and heavy. My heart hammered in my chest. I rushed into the room, brandishing my flashlight, but the kitchen was empty. The back door was locked, just as I'd left it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just Halloween. Kids playing pranks, I muttered under my breath. But the unease gnawed at me, that feeling that someone was watching, waiting. I turned off the porch lights, hoping it would signal to any other late-night visitors that the night was over. But just as I settled back on the couch, I saw it. The same masked boy, standing outside the living room window, his hands pressed against the glass. A chill ran through my whole body. He didn't move, just stared through the window, the mask expressionless in the dim glow of the TV. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. But when I turned back to the window, he was gone. I called the police, barely able to keep my voice steady. They arrived 20 minutes later, but by then, the boy had disappeared without a trace. They told me it was probably a prank, but when they shone their flashlights outside, they found something that made my stomach lurch. In the dirt outside the window, there were footprints, small, like a child's, but the strange thing was they didn't lead away. They circled the house, over and over, like he'd been watching me the whole time. As the officers left, one of them turned back, a strange look on his face. There used to be a family that lived out here, he said. Their son went missing years ago, vanished on Halloween night. Some say he still wanders around, looking for a way back inside. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought of those empty eyes staring at me through the glass. And every Halloween since, I make sure all the lights are off by 10, just in case he's still out there looking for a way in. Brian showed up late to the Halloween campfire, the last one to arrive. His friends were already gathered around the crackling flames, their faces lit in flickering orange. They had all worn masks, cheap, simple ones from the dollar store, part of some silly game they decided to play for the night. The woods were dark, the air thick with the smell of smoke and fallen leaves. Brian shivered as he stepped closer to the fire. "Finally, we thought you bailed," one of his friends called, his voice muffled behind a skull mask. Brian shook his head, pulling out his own mask, a plain, featureless white face. "Got lost in the woods," he replied, trying to sound casual. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him on the walk-in, just beyond the tree line. He slipped on the mask, the firelight dimming through the eye holes. "Ready for the mask game?" Another friend asked, holding up a candle. It was a Halloween tradition, supposedly a way to connect with spirits. The rules were simple. Everyone wore a mask, and you had to walk through the woods alone, making your way back without speaking. They always joked about someone getting lost or encountering a ghost, but Brian had never found it funny. The first 3 friends wandered into the woods, their footsteps fading into the night. Brian watched their masks disappear among the shadows, the darkness swallowing them. He felt the weight of the forest pressing in, the branches shifting like skeletal fingers. By the time it was his turn, a knot of unease had settled in his stomach. He took a deep breath and stepped away from the fire, the cold air biting through his jacket. The woods were silent, the trees looming like dark sentinels. Each crunch of leaves underfoot echoed in his ears. as if the forest was listening. He walked for what felt like hours, trying to remember the way back to the clearing. Then he heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, a hushed whisper that didn't belong to any of his friends. Brian froze, straining to hear, but the voice faded into the wind. He quickened his pace, suddenly desperate to return to the fire. When he finally stumbled back into the clearing, he stopped short. His friends were gathered around the fire, but something was off. Their masks, simple and cheap before, now seemed strange, more elaborate, like antique theater masks, their faces twisted in expressions of laughter and sorrow. "Nice try, guys," he called, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "Who brought the new masks?" But no one answered. They all just stared at him, their faces eerily still behind the masks. Brian's pulse quickened, a chill settling in his bones. He took a step closer to the firelight, trying to see their eyes behind the masks, but the shadows made it impossible. "Okay, very funny. You're creeping me out." One of them, wearing a mask with a cracked smile, tilted their head. The movement was slow, too deliberate. Brian took a step back, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. "Where's the others?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But deep down, he already knew something was terribly wrong. The figures around the fire didn't respond. Instead, one of them reached out, holding a second mask in their hands. His mask, the plain white one he'd dropped somewhere in the woods. They placed it gently on the ground in front of the fire, like an offering. Brian's breath hitched. He turned, ready to bolt back into the woods, but more figures emerged from the darkness. Masks just like those around the fire, their faces too smooth, too empty. They circled him, closing in, blocking any path of escape. In a panic, he tore off his own mask and threw it to the ground. "I'm done. The game's over," he shouted, his voice trembling. But the figures didn't move. The shadows around him deepened, the fire casting wild, shifting shapes on the ground. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing them away, telling himself it was all just a prank. When he finally opened his eyes again, the clearing was empty. No fire, no figures, just the cold wind rustling the leaves. Brian stood there alone, his breath clouding in the night air, the silence of the woods pressing in. He grabbed his mask from the ground, clutching it tightly as he stumbled back toward the path. But as he reached the edge of the woods, he glanced back one last time and saw them. The figures, watching him from the darkness, their faces half hidden behind their masks. He never spoke about that night to anyone, but sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear the sound of leaves crunching underfoot outside his window, as if someone, or something, was still waiting for him to finish the game. The camping trip started like any other Halloween adventure. Me, Claire, Danny, and Justin packed into Danny's van, laughing our way toward the cabin deep in the woods. We'd done this every year since high school, spending Halloween night telling ghost stories around a campfire, far from the trick-or-treaters and crowded parties. The cabin was small and remote, perfect for a spooky night. By the time we arrived, the sun had already set, casting long shadows across the forest. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp leaves, and the only light came from the moon peeking through the trees. We built a fire in the clearing, its glow barely reaching the edges of the woods around us. The flames crackled, and we settled into our old routine, passing around beers and trying to outscare each other with stories. Claire kicked things off with a classic urban legend, and Justin followed with a story about a haunted road. When it was my turn, I decided to mix things up. "How about we play a game?" I suggested, leaning forward, letting the firelight dance across my face. Ever heard of the Midnight Dare? I had just made it up on the spot, but they didn't need to know that. The rules were simple. We'd all close our eyes, and one person would wander into the woods, hide, and then try to make it back to the fire without being noticed. It sounded silly, but the woods had a way of turning shadows into something more. Danny rolled his eyes, but Claire seemed intrigued. "I'll go first," she said, pulling up her hood. She walked into the darkness, her flashlight bobbing through the trees until it vanished completely. We closed our eyes, counting down from 100, the cold seeping into our bones as the fire popped and hissed. When we reached 0, we opened our eyes, expecting Claire to jump out and scare us. But there was only the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind through the branches. We called out for her, but the woods swallowed our voices. Minutes stretched on, and a creeping unease settled in my gut. I stood up, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. Claire, come on, you win. Just come back. Danny and Justin exchanged nervous glances. Maybe she got lost, Danny muttered. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam revealed only the tangled underbrush. We decided to split up and search, agreeing to meet back at the fire in 10 minutes. I walked deeper into the woods, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my pulse race. Every rustle in the leaves made me turn sharply, expecting to see her grinning at me. But instead, I found something else, a mask, lying half-buried in the dirt. It was a cheap, plastic thing white with hollow eye holes. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my hands shaking, wondering if this was Claire's idea of a prank. Very funny, Claire, I called, my voice breaking the stillness. But my own voice sounded small and fragile against the endless rows of trees. Then I heard a sound, footsteps, crunching leaves, moving quickly toward me. I spun around, but the beam of my flashlight caught nothing but darkness. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint whisper, so soft I couldn't make out the words. I stumbled back toward the campfire, heart hammering in my chest, and nearly tripped over something in the dark. When I pointed my flashlight down, I froze. It was another mask identical to the first. I burst into the clearing, finding Danny and Justin already there, their faces pale in the firelight. They both held masks like mine. She's messing with us, Justin said, but his voice shook. Right? Before I could answer, a figure stepped into the clearing just beyond the fire's edge. It wore a hooded jacket and a mask, like the ones we had found, but with eyes that glittered strangely in the firelight. Claire, I asked, taking a step forward, but the figure remained silent. And then, with a sudden movement, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. Danny and Justin took off after it, calling her name, their flashlights cutting through the trees. I hesitated, a cold realization settling over me. The figure's height, the way it moved, it wasn't right. But before I could warn them, their lights disappeared into the darkness. I called their names, but the only reply was the echo of my own voice. I waited by the fire alone, my hands gripping the mask. Hours passed, the flames dying down to embers, and no one came back. Only the crunching of leaves continued somewhere in the distance, getting closer, then fading away like a slow, deliberate circle around the fire. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled back to the cabin. The van was still there, but my friends never returned. I called the police, but they found no trace of them. No masks, no footprints, nothing but the ashes of the Halloween fire. Now, every Halloween, I come back to the woods, hoping that maybe I'll find them. But all I ever find is a mask, new, pristine, lying in the dirt like it's waiting for me to pick it up. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you. And one more thing, the one who solves the code for my previews will get a secret bonus. Good luck.